How do you divide your equity? This is my definitive guide on how you divide up equity between you, your co-founders, your employees. How do you do it? There are 8 different topics we're going to cover. You're going to see me looking down just like I am there because there is so much to talk about. I don't want to screw it up. But the bottom line is 2 things that you need to remember. The first is be fair. If you let fairness guide you between you and your employees, you'll be on the right side. Number 2, be generous. Generosity pays off, and I'm going to explain why with an exact example later in today's video. But if you're fair and you're generous, you're going to be on the right track. Hi, I'm Brett Fox, and I've been around startups now for over 20 years. I've built some, I've been involved in some, I've invested in some, I've worked with a lot of startup CEOs. So I've got a pretty good idea of how to divide up equity and the issues that you're going to face as a startup CEO. So let's go. So why do you give equity to your employees? There are actually 2 fundamental reasons which are really important. The first is that equity means they're owners of the company. Equity means they own stock in the company and they're owners in the employees. And when you own something, you're likely to care about it a little bit more. The second reason is even more important. Equity leads to retention. When you give people equity and they've got a lot of stock in something, they want to stick around. And if you keep giving them equity, which is really important, they'll stay around even longer. And I'm going to show you a real live example of this, of how this works as we go through today's video. So those are the 2 reasons. So now let's give out the 8 keys, these 8 different things that you've got to think about as you go through your equity distribution. This is why I'm going to be looking down a little bit because there's a lot here and I don't want to screw it up. And I've got notes. So what's the first one? The first one is, how should you think about equity splits? Well, when you split up equity, you're dividing it up first amongst you and your co-founders and then amongst your employees. So, as I said, you want fairness to kind of guide you. That's your first piece of everything, and generosity should be your second piece. Now, the simple way to divide up equity between you and your co-founders, everybody gets the same amount. And that's not a bad way to go, actually. You could say if there are 3 of you and you've each got the same amount of experience, you could divide it up into thirds. You get a third and your 2 other co-founders get a third each. But let's say you may have a little bit more experience than your co-founders. Should it be maybe you get 90% and they get 10%? Nope. That's going to lead to disaster if you do that. It's very likely if you do something like that, then it's way too out of balance. But maybe instead, maybe you should be getting 40% and your 2 other co-founders would divide up the other 60, so you get 30 each. Or maybe you get 50 if you've really got a lot more experience and your 2 other co-founders get 25 each. You have to let common sense guide you. There are no rules here. You just want to be smart. So that's what you want to do. That's the first piece that you need to think about. So how much equity should your co-founders get? Like I said, there are no rules here. You need to let common sense guide you. There are some basic things you can look at for various roles that will help, but really it's between what you think is fair and what your co-founders think is fair. Now, here's a problem you're likely to run into. Your co-founders may have no idea how much equity they're supposed to get. So it's not a negotiation between you and your co-founders. That's not what this is about. It's not about you trying to squeeze every share out here. You have to look out for your co-founders. That's part of the challenge here is if they don't have an idea how much equity they should get, then you have to look out for them. You have to really think about, well, here's what it should be. You can start off with this idea of each of you getting the same amount. It's a reasonable way to do it. And if all of you have the same amount of experience, that'll work reasonably well. But as I said, if things are a little bit different and one of you has a lot more experience than the other, then you're going to want to tweak things around. Or if one of your roles is going to be more significant than the others, whatever it is, use your common sense to guide you. So this leads to the inevitable third question. How do you protect yourself from problems? Because what happens, and this is the classic problem, I've just given my co-founder a third of the company. And now the co-founder quits 6 months in, and guess what? You have a huge problem on your hands. I've seen this one happen where now you have a co-founder that left and they have 33% of the company. So how do you protect yourself against this? There's an easy way. It's what's called vesting. You want all of your stock and your employees' stock to vest over time. So the way that you do this is in two parts. The first is what's called a cliff. And a cliff means nothing vests for a period of time until you hit the cliff, you fall over the cliff, and then it vests. Typically, for most stock option agreements and equity agreements between founders, there's a 12-month cliff, which means for the first 12 months, nothing vests. Then, essentially, because most stock deals are 4-year deals, that then a quarter of the options or the stock vests at that point. Then monthly after that, for the next 36 months, typically the rest of the stock vests. That's how you protect yourself. So let's say you hired the wrong person and you're 6 months in, just like I described, you realize you've screwed up. Well, this is how you're protected. You move on, your co-founder moves on, everybody's okay. You're not trying to hurt your co-founder, you just recognize you've made a bad decision. Now, here's the thing. Over 50% of founder relationships end up in failure, where one of you is going to leave. That's why having vesting is so important for you to do. So make sure you do this. Okay, now let's go to question number 4. How do you deal with the money that you and your co-founders put in the company? And how is this different from your equity as an employee or a founder? Okay, this is a really good question. And there's a little bit of detail here that I need to walk through with you. When you put money in, essentially to your company, you're an investor. You're no different than any investor. The money needs to be treated differently than your equity that you're building up as a founder or as an employee. So how do you do this? Well, you break it up into 2 chunks. You have a chunk as investors, you have a chunk as employees. So now let's say that you and your co-founder let's say you put in $50,000 each into the company as a starting point, to have some money to run the business. This shouldn't be treated as you get 50%, your co-founder gets 50% of the company. No, no, no. This is your investor money. So let's say a typical round, and this would be typically for each round of funding that you do, you're going to give up roughly 20% of the company. So let's say you determine that, you know what, this is about 20% of the company that we should get for investing $100,000. It's $50,000 each between the two of you. Now, what should you get? What should your co-founder get? Well, your co-founder should get 10%. You should get 10% of the company for this. Now, what about vesting, you're asking? This doesn't vest because this is an investment. It's preferred stock, which I'm going to talk about. Preferred stock versus common stock. There's a difference there. Preferred stock, if you look at the way the stock is done, there's what's called a liquidation preference. And for stock, preferred stock is given away first before the common stock is given away. So investors always get paid off before the employees. Now there's all sorts of variants in here, which I'm not going to get to today and how that's done. But for simplicity's sake, assume the preferred stock is given away first. So your investment, your $50,000, that's preferred stock. You get 10% ownership instantly, as does your co-founder 50% ownership instantly. I'm sorry, 10% ownership each, instantly, okay? That's how that works. Now, the stock that you get, that means you've got 80% left between you and your co-founder to split up. Now, whatever way you've done that, let's say it's a 50-50 split, that 40% split, now that vests over time with that 4-year vesting schedule that I talked about. That's how that piece works. By the way, if you're not taking notes, pause this video right now and go get a notepad and a pen and paper so that you can take some notes about what I'm talking about here. It's pretty straightforward, but these are important things. So this is really important to do here. So you want to break these 2 pieces up because you're essentially an investor at this piece. Now, let's say there's a variant in here. Let's say you put in $50,000 and your co-founder puts in nothing. Well, guess what? You as $50,000, let's say you determine that's worth 10% of the company at this point in time. Okay, you own 10% straight out with this $50,000 investment. That's 10%. Now there's 90% to divide up between you and your co-founder. Let's say it's again this 50-50 split, you get 45. Your co-founder gets 45%, but you in total now own 55% of the company, that 10 plus the 45. But the difference is you've got 10% preferred, 45% common, and that 45% common stock that vests over time. So what happens if you and your co-founders can't agree on the equity? What happens here? This is really a scary moment, because if you can't agree, I will tell you from experience, this is a big warning sign, especially if you're going out of your way to be fair and be generous, and your co-founder, for whatever reason, can't see it. You know what I would tell you to do? And this is really scary, but this is what I would tell you. If you can't come to an agreement, you should move on. I'm sorry. I know it sucks. I know how hard it is to find really good co-founders, but if you can't come to an agreement on equity and you're trying to be fair and you're trying to be generous, truly being fair, truly being generous, then you know what? Move on. Find another co-founder, because this co-founder is going to cause problems all the way through your company's life. I've seen this movie before. I've lived this movie before. I will tell you from experience, you're much better off moving on. Okay, there's another classic question. What about investors? How do you deal with them? How much should they get? Okay, well, here's my simple, basic way to look at this. Now, I told you earlier that each round, typically, investors are going to get around 20% ownership, each round of funding. So it's going to keep getting diluted by 20%, everybody's ownership in the company by 20% typically. Now, should you go to an investor and say, yes, here, Mr. Investor, here, I think you should get 20% ownership. I don't think that's the right way to do it. I don't think that's smart. Now, why do I believe this? Well, first of all, who's done more deals, you or investors? That's right, the investors have. So what's a better way to do this? What's a more savvy way to explain how much investors should get? Instead of opening the negotiation with investors, because investors are going to ask you, here's a better answer. And I'll show you the counter to this as well in just a second. Here's a better answer. Say to investors, we're going to let the market determine how much we should get and how much you should get. Now, what's the market? Well, guess what? The market is investors at this point. They are the market for your stock. They're not going to be deterred or swayed by what you say. Now, if you say, we think you should get 3%, they're going to laugh at you and walk away, and you're going to look like an idiot. So don't do it. You're much better off letting the market determine it. If they say to you, you know, we should get 25% ownership for this round of funding, well, then so be it. The only way you're going to have leverage on them is by having multiple investors competing for you at the same time, which is really challenging to do. Now, if you're lucky to do this, and I've seen it happen, that's how you're going to get a better deal. So much better off saying the market. Now, let's say, you know what, we'd really like to hear from you first. Give a range. Now, the way that you answer it this way is you say something like this. What we've seen typically for deals like us at stage of the company that we're at is typically around 20%, whatever the number is that you come up with. You could say 15 if you want. You could say 20. I wouldn't say more than 20, and I wouldn't say less than 15, maybe 10, depending upon how much money you're asking for and where you're at in the company's life. Again, there are no rules here. Just be careful here, because you can cost yourself a deal by saying the wrong thing here. That's why it's so important. Let the investor lead. Let's talk about preferred stock versus common stock. I already gave you an explanation for this, but let me go over it again. What is preferred stock? Preferred stock is stock in this liquidation preference table that investors have in terms of how the company is liquidated upon some sort of liquidation event. Well, what's a liquidation event? It's when you sell the company, it's when you go IPO, you merge, Those are liquidation events. So what happens is, let's say that you have $10 million of investment and you sell the company, and let's say investors own 20% of the company, which means the company is worth $50 million, let's say. And you sell the company for $50 million. Well, the investors are going to take their $10 million first, and then depending upon the way that the liquidation preferences are set up, they're going to take they're either going to divide it up evenly with you or do something else. It all depends. But they're going to get paid off first. That's why preferred stock is more valuable than common stock. That's why investors insist upon preferred stock, is because they want to make sure they get paid off first. So let's say that the company's only worth $10 million. It's a horrible event for everybody. Companies sold for $10 million. They're going to get paid off first. Common stock is what you have when you invest in the stock market, is what you will have as the CEO of your company once you take money from an investor. You will get paid off second if there's any left over. And as I said, there are all sorts of different liquidation preferences out there. There's participating preferred, there's 2x liquidation preferences, there's 1x liquidation preferences, all sorts of crazy things. I'm not going to go over all of them in today's discussion, but they're there. You can look them up. I think Investopedia has a nice explanation of this if you want to look at it. So that's the difference between preferred and common stock. Now let's talk about employee stock options. How do you deal with this, especially when you're starting out? So you've carved out your preferred stock for investors. They've gotten their, let's say, 20%. And now let's say the 80% has been divided up between you and your co-founders. What about employees coming forward? How do you deal with this? Well, the first step is determining how much stock you need for probably the next 2 years. That would be typically what you would do. So what you would do is you would look at employee by employee, how much stock each employee is going to get. So let me give you some general rules here. Vice president, typically about 1%. Senior director level person, about 0.75%, give or take. Managers, about 0.5%. This is early on, by the way. These change over time. But early stage, after funding, these are the right numbers. Managers, roughly 0.5%. Early employees, junior employees, probably about 0.25%, maybe less than that, depending upon what they're doing. These would be like engineering kind of roles or manager roles. These would be good guidelines to go by. So this might be what you would do for each person. You figure out, okay, I'm going to need X of this, Y of that. You add it up. This is going to give you a rough idea of how much stock you're going to need for the next 2 years. That's typically what you would do. And this is what I would go back and ask my board for. Now, I've also had it be where I've had a board. In fact, I had a company like this where the board only wanted to give me 1 year of stock. And then I would have to go back each year and ask for more. Okay, fine. Whatever it is. It's not a big deal either way. Preferably 2 years, because you really don't want to have to go back to your board more than that. Now, you want to make sure you get these numbers right, because it kind of sucks if you go back 6 months later after you've asked the board for 2 years worth of stock and you've given it all away. Stock is not candy here, guys. It is not. You want to make sure you get these numbers right. You want to be disciplined about what you do. And again, you want to be generous and fair, but you also want to be consistent on what you do with stock. And if you do this right, you'll get this reasonably right. And then 2 years later, you'll go back and ask for more. Now for the final point. Now I talked about, and I kind of alluded to the fact of why is stock important? And I talked about, stock is a retention tool, right? It's why you do it. It's to retain employees. Now let me show you a real life example of what happens when you do this right versus doing this wrong. So I was with 2 companies, one after the other. The first company, Maxim Integrated Products, excellent company, really well run. And they had a very generous stock option program. In fact, they did something called refreshing stock, which is a smart thing to do. And let me explain what refreshing is. So you always want to have a carrot of stock going forward for your employees. So if you do a 4-year deal, you're 4 years into the company, and there's no more stock left, why is an employee going to stick around? Well, just on the basis of money, they may not. So what do? You refresh them. You think about rehiring them again. So how much would you give a new employee for this role? Well, whatever it is, that's what this person should get. So typically you give them 2 more years of stock, so they always have at least 2 to 4 years of stock ahead of them. That's refreshing. That's a smart way to do things. So Maxim did this very, very well. And as a result, typically employees didn't leave 9, 10, 11, 12 years into the company's life. Barely anybody left because they were really smart about stock. So what happens if you get this wrong? Well, the other company that I work with in the exact same industry, a company called Micrel, they didn't do this. Their stock option refreshing program was a joke. Instead of paying employees what they should have paid employees to keep them around, they paid them like 1/10 of what they should do. So you'd have this big amount of stock and then it would dribble away to nothing. Guess what the average lifetime of a Micrel employee was? That's right, 4 years. That's the difference. Do this right, you can retain employees for a long time. If you do this wrong, you're going to have a lot of turnover here. That's why it's important to get this right, because you can keep employees, you can retain employees for long periods of time. And when you have employee turnover, it costs you money. It costs you execution. It hurts your culture if you're always turning over employees. So that's why this is so important. So one more thought. Okay, so one more thought on all of this. Equity is a really important part of keeping your company going and doing the right thing and retaining employees, being generous, being fair. All of this is really important. But there's one more thought here on all of this. And that is that it's not enough to have a great stock option program. It's not enough to be generous. It's not enough to be fair. To keep employees and retain employees, you need a great culture to go along with your great option plan and option program. All the stuff fits together. So if you have a great team, hiring is key to all of this. Hire great people, pay them generously, treat them well, execute on your plan. That's how you will keep your team together and retain employees. That's what makes this work. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm Brett at brettjfox.com. Have a great, great day.